Hi, welcome back to the channel. For the last few weeks, we've talked about Russia's fuel emergency. And in today's episode, I want to show you why that emergency is no longer confined to a handful of refineries. It's now spreading across the whole of the country, and the economic consequences are becoming much harder for the Kremlin to hide. Now, this story isn't simply about fuel. It's about something much bigger. It's about whether Ukraine's strategy of attacking Russia's oil infrastructure is finally beginning to have a meaningful impact on the Russian economy. Now, over the last few years, we've reported on dozens of drone attacks against Russian oil refineries. Every few weeks, there's more headlines. Another refinery has been struck, another storage depot is on fire, another processing plant has been damaged. And every time that's happened, the immediate question was always the same. Does this actually matter? Because Russia is an enormous country. It's one of the world's largest producers of crude oil, pumping around 9 million barrels of oil every single day out of the ground, making it one of the biggest energy producers on this planet. So when one refinery is attacked, the general assumption is that Russia simply repairs it, diverts supplies from somewhere else, and carries on as if nothing happened. But I think we're now reaching the point where we can finally see the cumulative impact of all of these attacks from Ukraine, because today fuel shortages are no longer isolated incidents. They are spreading all across Russia. Gasoline stations are introducing restrictions, drivers are queuing for fuel, prices are rising sharply in many regions, businesses are beginning to feel the impact, and perhaps most remarkably of all, the Russian government is now lowering fuel quality standards because it simply doesn't have enough refined fuel to meet domestic demand. If we just think about that for a moment, one of the world's largest oil producers is now reducing the quality of its end products because it can't produce enough for its own population. That is an extraordinary position for Russia to find itself in. Now, before we go on to talk about the details in today's video, could I ask you to give me a thumbs up for this video? Maybe hype it if you've still got the hype option. If you see it next to the thumbs up, please hit that hype. It does help me with this video. And please subscribe if you haven't done so already, because it helps me with the algorithm and helps to promote these videos to more people on YouTube. Now, to understand how we've reached this point, we need to go back and look at what Ukraine has actually been doing, because contrary to what some people believe, Ukraine hasn't been trying to destroy Russia's oil industry. If that was the sole objective, it would be virtually impossible because Russia is simply too large. Instead, Ukraine has adopted a much smarter strategy. Rather than targeting crude oil production, it's been targeting the part of the system that actually turns crude oil into usable products, the refineries. And that distinction is incredibly important because crude oil on its own has very little practical use. You can't fill your family car with crude oil or put it into a tractor or a delivery van or a bus or an aircraft. Before you can use any of those items, crude oil has to be refined. So that's where gasoline is produced, and diesel and jet fuel and heating oil and lubricants and petrochemicals. All of those products are created inside refineries. So by repeatedly attacking refineries, Ukraine isn't trying to stop Russia pumping oil out of the ground. It's trying to stop Russia turning that crude oil into fuels that keep the economy moving. And over time, that's having a significant effect. Reuters has estimated that 16 of Russia's major refineries have been hit by drones in 2026 alone. And that's disrupted around 700,000 barrels per day of refining capacity. Now, that's roughly double the level of disruption seen during the same period in 2025. Now, those numbers might not sound dramatic immediately, but remember what we're talking about. These aren't small local facilities. Many of these are among Russia's largest refineries, facilities that process hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per day, facilities that supply enormous regions with gasoline and diesel. So every single successful attack removes another piece of Russia's refining capacity. One refinery might be repaired, then another is hit. A third then suffers some damage, and a fourth then has to reduce production. Eventually, the disruption starts to spread through the whole system. And I think that's the point we've got to today. Now let me show you this map because I think it tells the whole story better than any graph or statistics can. As you can see, Russia has been divided into regions according to the severity of the fuel shortages. The orange regions represent regions where there are partial restrictions in terms of the sale of finished products such as gasoline and diesel. The red area represents regions experiencing severe shortages. And the first thing that strikes you is just how widespread this problem has become. This isn't one isolated province. This isn't one refinery experiencing technical problems. It's spread across an enormous area. Russia is the largest country in the world geographically. If we start in southern Russia, you can immediately see multiple regions experiencing restrictions. If we move eastwards and those restrictions continue further into Siberia, more regions are affected. Then head back towards western Russia and once again you find shortages appearing across multiple areas. In fact, what's more surprising is how few regions remain completely unaffected. This is no longer a local issue, it's becoming a nationwide logistical problem. And that's important because Russia, as I said, is the largest country on earth. Fuel doesn't simply appear wherever you need it, it has to be transported, sometimes hundreds of miles or even thousands of miles, by pipeline, by rail, by tanker or by road. When one refinery goes offline, another refinery then has to increase its production to try to make up for the gap. Then that fuel has to travel further to reach customers. So the transport costs rise, the journey time increases, the system becomes less efficient. Now, if we imagine that process happening not once, but 16 times as those 16 major refineries are hit, imagine multiple refineries all suffering disruption over the course of the last few months. Eventually, the system reaches a point where it can't keep up. And that's where we are today. Even Moscow, which normally receives priority supplies, has reportedly experienced queues at filling stations following repeated attacks on the capital's largest refinery. That's symbolic because shortages have traditionally been confined to the regions much closer to the fighting. Now they're beginning to reach Russia's political and economic heart. Now let's have a look at this map because in many ways I think this one's even more revealing. The first map showed us the overall picture across Russia. This map zooms in on the occupied territories in Ukraine and particularly Crimea. And the first thing you'll probably notice is that everything is red. Basically, we've got severe fuel restrictions in Crimea, southern occupied Ukraine, the land corridor connecting Russia to Crimea. Large sections of these territories are all experiencing high levels of restrictions. So why is that important? Well, these are the areas that Russia has spent years trying to integrate into its own economy. Since annexing Crimea back in 2014, which was 12 years ago, the Kremlin has invested billions of rubles building roads, bridges, ports, rail links and energy infrastructure. The message has always been that these territories were now fully integrated with Russia and could be supplied just like any other part of the country. But this map is telling us a different story. It shows that these regions are now amongst the hardest hit anywhere in Russian-controlled territories. And that's because geography matters. Almost everything has to be transported into Crimea. Fuel arrives by rail, by road and across the Kursk bridge. If supplies are disrupted further north or refineries are unable to produce enough fuel, Crimea feels the pressure very quickly. And that's what we're starting to see. In some parts of Crimea, gasoline prices have risen to 189 rubles per litre. To put that into context, that's around £1.80 or $2.40 per litre and close to 3 times the normal price that motorists would expect to pay. But perhaps even more remarkable than the price is the fact that in many places, people simply can't buy as much fuel as they want. Many filling stations have introduced a limit of just 20 litres per customer. Now 20 litres isn't a full tank. For many cars, that's only enough to get through a couple of days of normal driving. And if you're a delivery driver or a tradesperson or a taxi driver or a farmer or anyone that relies on their vehicle to earn a living or transport them back and forward to work, then suddenly that becomes a serious problem because fuel isn't just another product. It's what allows the entire economy to function. Every loaf of bread in the supermarket, every online delivery, every construction site or bus service or refuge lorry or ambulance or police vehicle or farm harvesting crops, every haulage company moving containers, they all depend on a reliable access to fuel. It's one of those things that we rarely think about until it becomes difficult to obtain. And when shortages begin to appear, the economic consequences spread remarkably quickly. Businesses start paying more. Some businesses begin stockpiling fuel because they're worried supplies might deteriorate. That creates even more demand, which creates longer queues, which increases shortages. It's a really vicious cycle. If you've ever thought about panic buying, you know the feeling. You rush to your car, you rush to the gas station, and you suddenly find that there's hundreds of people doing the same thing. Well, that's what's happening in Russia. And this is a pattern that's spreading across the whole of the country. Once confidence disappears, shortages often become self-fulfilling. People buy more than they need. Storage tanks empty very quickly. The next customer has to wait longer. Eventually, the government has little choice but to introduce rationing. And that's exactly what's happening across Russia right now. Now, I think the next development is perhaps the most extraordinary of all, because rather than simply trying to increase production, the Russian government is now considering what only a couple of years ago would have been unthinkable. It's considering lowering fuel quality standards. Now, on the face of it, that might not sound particularly dramatic. Some people probably think, well, fuel's fuel, isn't it? I don't care whether it's good quality or bad quality. But that's not how modern engines work. Modern diesel and modern gasoline are produced to extremely high standards. Over the last 20 years, countries around the world have progressively reduced sulfur levels and improved fuel quality. And the reason is simple. Cleaner fuel reduces pollution, it improves engine performance, it protects emission systems, and generally helps modern vehicles last longer. Russia has spent years upgrading its refineries to produce fuel that meets those modern standards. So the fact that officials are now discussing allowing production and imports of lower quality fuel tells you just how much pressure the refining system is currently under. In effect, they're saying we don't have enough high quality fuel, so we'd rather have more fuel available even if the quality isn't that good. And that may help ease shortages in the short term, but it also creates longer term problems. Lower quality fuel generally contains higher sulfur levels and more contaminants. That increases emissions, it can reduce efficiency, and over time, it can place additional stress on catalytic converters, particulate filters, injectors, and other expensive engine components. Now, that doesn't mean every vehicle in Russia will suddenly break down overnight, but if you're running a logistics company with hundreds of trucks, or a farming business with expensive machinery, or a bus company operating every day, higher maintenance costs eventually become another financial burden. So Russia isn't really solving the problem, it's simply moving parts of the cost into the future. And I think that's a really important economic point. When shortages become severe enough, governments often have to choose between two bad options. Either maintain quality standards and accept that supplies remain limited, or lower standards so that there's more product available. Neither option is ideal. One results in shortages, the other potentially increases maintenance costs, pollution, and equipment wear and tear. The fact that Russia is now seriously discussing this second option shows just how difficult the current situation has become. And perhaps the greatest irony in all of this is that Russia remains one of the world's biggest crude oil exporters. Every day, millions of barrels of oil continue to leave the country. But because refining capacity has been damaged, Russia increasingly finds itself in the extraordinary position of exporting raw crude while struggling to produce enough gasoline and diesel for domestic consumption. That's a remarkable reversal. Now, normally countries want to refine as much oil as possible because refined products are worth significantly more than crude oil, and they create more jobs, they generate more tax revenue, and they add much more value to your economy. So every barrel of crude that has to be exported instead of being refined in Russia represents more economic loss. It's another hidden cost of this refinery campaign. So when you start adding all of these things together, reduced refining capacity, higher transport costs, fuel shortages, rationing, higher prices, lower quality fuel, lost value-added production, you begin to see why this story is no longer just about fuel. It's becoming a story about the wider Russian economy. Now, up until this point, we've mainly been talking about the economic impact, but there's another reason why I think this story has become so significant. For a long time, the Russian authorities have played down the impact of these refinery attacks. Whenever a refinery was hit, officials would say generally the fire has been extinguished quickly, production will resume shortly, supplies will remain stable, and there was nothing for people to worry about. Now, that message was designed to reassure the public in Russia, because once people lose confidence in essential supplies, shortages become much worse. If everyone rushes to fill their tanks at the same time, fuel stations run dry more quickly, that then spreads on the internet, everybody hears the news, and regardless of how much fuel is actually available, a panic starts. And over the last few days, we're starting to hear a different message from Russia. President Putin has now publicly acknowledged that fuel shortages exist in parts of Russia. Now, he was always keen to stress that the government is taking action. Officials have established a task force that are redistributing supplies, looking at further export restrictions, considering additional imports, and examining temporary changes to fuel quality regulations. So the message from the Kremlin is still very much that the situation can be managed. But the important point is that there is now an acknowledgement that a problem exists. And for me, that's quite telling. Governments rarely admit to shortages of essential goods unless the evidence has become impossible to ignore. Now, another interesting development over the weekend was Ukraine's proposal to halt long-range attacks by both sides. On the surface, that sounds like a relatively modest, confidence-building measure. Ukraine suggested that both countries stop carrying out long-range strikes against targets deep inside others' territory. If agreed, that would obviously have included Ukraine's drone attacks against Russian oil refineries. Now, from an economic perspective, that could have provided Russia with an opportunity to repair damaged facilities, rebuild fuel stocks, and gradually stabilize supplies. But President Putin has rejected the proposal. His argument is that Ukraine is currently under military pressure and is looking for a pause to rebuild its forces, replenish equipment, and strengthen its defensive positions. From the Kremlin's perspective, agreeing to such a pause would simply allow Ukraine to recover before fighting resumes. So Russia has chosen to continue its current military strategy. Now, I'm not going to get into whether that's the right or wrong decision militarily, but economically, it has one very obvious consequence. If the refinery attacks continue, then the pressure on Russia's fuel system is going to continue also, and perhaps become even more severe, because repairing a modern refinery isn't like repairing a damaged warehouse or replacing a few broken windows. We are talking about some of the most complex industrial facilities in the world. They contain thousands of pieces of highly specialized equipment, distillation columns, hydrocrackers, catalytic reformers, pumps, compressors, control systems, storage facilities, pipelines. Many of these components are custom built. Some take months to manufacture, others require specialist engineering teams to install. And if another drone attack happens before repairs are completed, the whole process starts again. So this isn't simply a question of repairing one refinery over a couple of days. Some facilities take months to return to full production. Others could continue operating below capacity for longer periods. And every month that this is happening places more pressure on the rest of the refining network. Now, one point that often gets overlooked is the cost of defending all of this infrastructure. Russia isn't just repairing damaged refineries, it's also trying to stop future attacks. That means deploying additional air defense systems, electronic warfare equipment, military personnel, surveillance systems, repair crews, emergency response teams, and all of that costs money. Russia, as I've said, is the largest country geographically on Earth. Its energy infrastructure stretches across thousands of miles. Protecting every refinery, every storage depot, and every pumping station is a logistical nightmare. So even if a refinery isn't hit, the cost of protecting it has increased significantly. That's another burden on the government finances, another burden on Russian businesses, and another hidden economic cost of this war. So when you step back and look at the bigger picture, something really interesting is starting to emerge. For much of this war, we focused on the sanctions, Interest rates, inflation, government borrowing, budget deficits, exchange rates, all of those are important indicators. But this story today is very different because this is something ordinary Russians can actually see and experience. They can see queues outside filling stations. They can see rationing notices. They can see prices increasing. Some can no longer fill their tanks when they want to. Businesses are now having to adapt. Haulage companies are paying more for their fuel. Farmers are also having to pay a higher price. Construction firms are seeing their costs increasing. And eventually all of these higher costs work their way through into the Russian economy. Food starts to become more expensive, as does goods. Transport and moving things is costing more. Inflation is now under more pressure. So economic growth will slow. So although today's story is technically about fuel, the consequences extend far beyond gasoline stations. This is really a story about the gradual erosion of economic capacity. And I think that's exactly what Ukraine is looking to achieve. Rather than attempting to destroy Russia's oil industry, it's been steadily increasing the economic cost of keeping that industry operating. One refinery's hit, then another refinery, then another. One drone attack rarely changes the course of a war, but hundreds of drone attacks over many months are starting to change the perspective. Eventually, these attacks begin to affect logistics, then production, then businesses, then consumers, and finally, the whole of the Russian economy. And that's why I think today's story is really important. We're no longer talking about isolated refinery fires. We're talking about shortages spreading across one of the world's largest countries. We're talking about rationing, lower quality fuel, higher prices, and a government that is now publicly acknowledging that there is a problem. Individually, each one of those developments could be shrugged off, but when you look at them collectively, they paint a really poor picture for the Russian economy. And they're suggesting that Ukraine's long-running campaign against Russian refinery industry is beginning to have a much broader economic impact than many people first expected that it would. Whether that ultimately changes Russia's military strategy remains to be seen, but what does seem increasingly clear is that the economic consequences of this war are no longer confined to government budgets or financial markets. They are now appearing at fuel pumps, on business balance sheets, and in the daily lives of ordinary Russians. And that's why I think this is one of the most important economic stories that we've covered on the channel in recent months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please hype this video if you can, if you've got that available to you. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that red subscribe button. It really does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. I want to say thank you so much to anyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. If you've sent me a YouTube super thanks, which I do get quite a few of, really appreciate that. Thank you. It really helps to keep me motivated. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through YouTube membership or Patreon, thank you. I really appreciate your support. I know I don't provide a huge amount in response to it. I do release a lot of my videos early to members on YouTube, so that's something that you get. On Patreon, I was posting videos on there, but very few people were watching them. So I was getting a handful of people watching. If you're one of those handful, apologies that I'm not posting on Patreon now, but their system is terrible. It takes so long to upload a video. It's really slow. And then you have to wait until it's fully uploaded before you're able to upload the thumbnail. And quite often it can take half an hour to an hour to upload the video. And by the time it's uploaded, I've moved on, I'm doing something else. I've forgotten that I'm uploading it. And then I forget to add the thumbnail. And so sometimes they didn't go out for a day or two because I'd forgotten because the process is so tedious. So in order, and because I've got quite a lot of things going on at the moment, I've taken a pause from posting on Patreon. Let me know what your thoughts on that are, if you are a patron, if you're missing it. But I'm hoping that everybody's okay with it. You can still watch on YouTube. But yeah, it was just taking me too long to do it. So apologies if you're a patron and you were watching them on Patreon system. They need to improve their systems, and I will go back to posting on there. But thank you so much for everybody that's supporting me.